Awesome. Thank you, Virginia. And yes, we will have a dialogue portion, and we'd love to also hear strategies from everybody who is on the webinar as well. Again, we know that each of you is an expert in many arenas, and we would love to pull those resources. We'll also be using the group chat to gather information. So we're hoping to both have this PowerPoint presentation and the offerings that Nika and I will give, but also to hear from everyone through the chat and also through a dialogue portion. So just to give everyone a heads up in terms of that. So again, thank you all so much for joining us for Healing Our Communities, Economic Justice for Survivors, Practical Strategies. Again, my name is Purvi Shah, and I'm the Senior Consultant here at the Women of Color Network and have been leading our Economic Policy and Leadership Project for about 7 to 8 years now, and so happy to share some of the information that we've garnered through this project. I wanted to start by giving a framework in terms of this. Let's see. I'm trying to see. There we go. Thank you. So I'm just going to say next slide. So welcome again. We're glad that everybody is here. And again, thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedules, especially at this moment. Next slide, please. Awesome. So we'd love to start off again by sort of mapping the wisdom that's on this webinar in terms of all the participants. So we'll just take a moment and if you could just share in terms of mapping economic insecurity and lineages, what economic needs do you see for survivors, particularly survivors of color and Indigenous survivors that you work with? And then also, what resources do you bring with you to the work? So again, feel free to share in the group chat responses to both of these questions. So we have sort of a framework of what we're trying to gather in terms of information. So again, what economic needs do you see for survivors that you work with, and particularly survivors of color and Indigenous survivors? And also, what resources are you bringing with you to the work? Awesome. So we're hearing legal status to work, housing, loans, credit, microloan programs, and then some resources include also having those microloan programs, the NNEDV work, the Purple Purse curriculum. Great. Yeah, absolutely. Finances for furthering education as a need, employment opportunities, childcare and transportation. Awesome. Thank you all so much for sharing this background in terms of, really lots of structural issues and specific concrete needs for survivors that you work with, as well as some of the resources that we see that exist. So thank you so much for offering that. All right. We'll move on to the next slide. Great. So now in terms of just situating where we are with the Economic Policy and Leadership Project, as everyone mentioned, everything from employment to access to education, to transportation, housing, all of these are not just, individual issues, but really what we at Women of Color Network see as structural needs. And that our access to some of these resources is definitely informed by historical oppression and the lack of wealth generation due to historical racism, misogyny, and other oppressions, and that we also feel that we see ourselves as catalyzing a movement forward. So as many of you may know, Susan Burton, who is the director at the New Way of Life Reentry Project, has talked about how being of poor and of color is a debt that keeps incurring interest. And so we really want to situate that the struggles that we see, the struggles that we have, that survivors have, are really part of historical oppression in the present day. And Kajwa offers us another lens to look at this, which is to say, if the leadership has failed, we are the new leaders. So just also to recognize how we can mobilize this response and this leadership, and that we are the leaders. So next slide, please. Sorry, folks, it seems like we're having a little bit of trouble in terms of getting the slides to move. So hold on just a second, bear with us. Awesome. So just to briefly situate in terms of the mission of the Women of Color Network, our mission is to eliminate violence against all women and in our communities by really centralizing the voices and promoting the leadership of women of color across sovereign nations, the United States, and the U.S. territories. And within this vein, we do so by really connecting various oppressions, and including everything from colonialism to heterosexism to transphobia, and to really recognizing that everything from police brutality to also sexual assault and disproportionate relationships, particularly with indigenous communities and other communities of color, is really all linked together, and that we want to make sure to really meet survivors where they are. And in order to do so, we have to work from an intersectional vantage point. In terms of the Economic Policy and Leadership Project, we lead with the vision that despite violence and inequity, our communities are resourceful, and that we deserve a voice at every table, and that we really need to inform the way that policies are shaped, and in fact that our inventive innovations in culturally specific programs really have the ability to transform the field, transform lives, transforms our communities and institutions generally. We see that particularly, I know that the work that I used to lead at Saki for South Asian Women, where I was the executive director for a long time, we worked a lot in terms of language access, and that work has really transformed national practice around language access for survivors. So we know, again, our innovations can support the field. When we think about economic policy and why we need an economic policy and leadership project, I just wanted to very briefly situate some of the needs that we see. So we know that equal pay is crucial for all women, but particularly women of color. And so we see from the National Women's Law Center data from 2016 that African American women working full-time year-round typically make only 63 cents for every dollar. Asian American women, 85 cents. Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander women, it's 70 cents. And for Latinas, it's 54 cents. And Indigenous women, it's 58 cents. So knowing that this remarkable in terms of inequity, we really need to challenge and ensure economic justice for our communities. In terms of waiting for equity, the really stark details is that Black women would have to wait until 2124 for equal pay, and Latina and Latinx women would have to wait until 22 to 48. So none of us have that kind of time in terms of waiting for equity. And again, this disparity is a cumulative result of historical oppression as well as present day oppression. So these disparities continue. We also want to recognize that women in same-sex couples have a median income of 38,000 when compared to men in same-sex couples, which is 47,000, and men in different sex couples at 48,000. It literally pays to be a man because trans women make less after they transition. And one study found that the average earnings of trans women workers fall by nearly 1/3 after transition. And also, women with disabilities working full-time year-round are typically paid just 72 cents for every dollar men without disabilities are paid. And then even compared to men with disabilities, this figure is 75 cents. So we see again that there's a fundamental inequity in terms of even our access to earning for equal pay. And so, of course, that has real ramifications. Some of the ramifications that we see are particularly linked to vulnerability to violence. So our partner, the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice, has showed that safety requires economic security. Again, I know y'all know this from your everyday work in the field, but this is really crucial to recognize that poverty increases the risk of violence. So we know that violence happens across all classes and groups. However, the vulnerability to violence, and particularly the access to resources to change that situation and to escape violence, that's where the link between poverty is really clear. So in terms of the connection between homelessness and also in terms of, again, access to resources. So we also know from our work that abuse creates economic instability. So it creates everything from income and job loss, to housing instability, which many of you spoke to limited access to transportation, which again, some of y'all spoke to, and also decreased access to childcare. So all of these are immediate needs that survivors may have, but also they create long-term impact, which is everything from educational growth and professional growth to credit damage, and ultimately to also thinking about our health and well-being and the cost of healthcare. Everything from mental health to reproductive health to physical health generally. So all of these are impacts to abuse and the economic impact of violence. So within our economic policy and leadership project, we really want to, given all this background and information, really nurture space for advocates to share information on economic security and gender-based violence so that we can deepen our practices and support survivors and each other. We want to also enable leadership development, particularly of women of color and Indigenous advocates doing economic justice and policy work. And we want to also share information on the range of policy advocacy so that we connect the structural transformation to also individual transformation and recognize that both really influence and help support each other. And then finally, we want to enable folks to really work across silos and have conversations across movements. And so it's really important for us that racial justice movements, that economic justice movements, that social justice movements more broadly are really connected to the work to end gender violence, because we know that our movements are connected, but also that survivors that are part of our communities see all of these intersections in their everyday lives. So the movement for queer liberation is no separate from the movement for survivors, and in terms of thinking about liberation collectively. Some of the work that we've done in terms of the Economic Policy and Leadership Project includes providing reports on everything from policy advocacy to T&U visas to tribal sexual assault. And in particular, we've also been thinking more recently in terms of what does economic justice mean, and what does it mean to heal on our own terms. And particularly, we've been, again, diving into this thread of mass incarceration in this country and the ways in which it affects survivors, particularly trans survivors, immigrant survivors in detention, and recognizing the impact of incarceration on Black and Brown communities. So when we think about, in this vein, what does economic justice really mean for our communities, we see that advocates have told us that economic justice is not only, though it is of course important about financial wealth and well-being, it is absolutely important to have equity in pay. It's absolutely important to be able to earn. But we've also heard from advocates and survivors that economic justice includes access to affordable education, food, housing, healthcare, including mental health and reproductive access. It includes jobs with security, benefits, training, and living wages. It includes resources and information to make the best decisions for our lives. And really fundamentally, it includes ability to be in connection with community, to heal, to be safe, to be sustainable, and really to be able to live fully with authenticity and dignity. So when we think about what economic justice means, absolutely the financial component is crucial, but what we see in the broader picture is also a structure and opportunities that really allow us to be our full selves. So in that vein, some of the voices from our project that I think are really significant for us to consider and to center is the connection of community organizing and healing. So Marcia Olivo, who many of you might know from the Miami Workers Center, talks about merging community organizing and healing because community organizing is healing, and the truth about healing is it is a way of life. Joyce Kyle speaks to how the justice system didn't recognize abuse without scars, and that healing is accepting the justice system needs repair. And finally, Linda Eagle-Speaker from the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center speaks to how, as Native Americans, we heal in ceremony and we must value our spirit. So for us at the Women of Color Network, this work in terms of economic justice is also spiritual work, it's organizing work, and it's a recognition that ultimately we seek to be safe, sustainable, and really connected in communities and our full selves. So I'm super excited with that framework and some of the work that we have done through the Women of Color Network to welcome Tanika Ellington, who is the Economic Empowerment Advocate at the Peace River Center in Florida. Many of you may know Tanika. She is such a powerhouse. She presented recently at our Southern Regional convening that we had in May in Miami, and I will tell you that everybody was wowed with all her practical strategies, and she sent me like 14 different handouts for tools and resources, and I'm just so excited to welcome Tanika and have her be able to offer her wisdom and all the information that she has in terms of practical strategies. So I'm going to pass it over now to Tanika to take it forward from here. Great. So Tanika, I think we just have to unmute you. So if you can just make sure to unmute yourself.
Let me find me.
Yep, I think you're unmuted now.
Okay.
Awesome. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon. And again, my name is Tanika Ellington from Peace River Center, Lakeland, Florida. It's an echo, so it's making me trip over my words. Okay. So I am the economic freedom advocate here at Peace River Center, economic justice, economic empowerment, all of the titles go together. So that is my title here at Peace River Center. We started out 4 years ago. So I am the first in my position here at Peace River Center. I am a survivor of intimate partner violence. So that is what brought me to the work. When we're going through things, we don't really understand why until we get over that hump and we get to our final destiny. So coming in with my own trials and my own personal experience, it helps. It helps to keep, me grounded in the work and to remember what those times are like when survivors are giving us those stories and telling us their real life traumas that sometimes seem, a little far, but when you have to keep your family safe, then some of those things are not, as traditional as some other safety plans may be. That is one thing that I found very true coming into the work, is that survivors, they already know how to stay safe. And a lot of the tools that we have to bring to the survivors, they may already have as well. And just to put things into perspective. So 4 years ago, we developed the Economic Empowerment Program, the Economic Freedom Program, with the Allstate Foundation, where we received the microloan and the IDA savings program. Through that program, we were able to do some wonderful things in our community, assisting many survivors with a startup business, the tools to save, going through all of the curriculum to, show them that it is possible, going through those practical spending plans and budgets to list everything that they are spending money on, as well as food stamps, to try to see if they're overspending in any areas, trying to encourage the meal planning, maybe having a meal plan that they can work with the children. And that's also a family activity to have that menu, and you can cut back on what you're utilizing food stamps for. So we've had a lot of our survivors be able to cut back that way. And, just an example of that, giving them those practical skills that they already, possess. We have the Pro Literacy program also. We had that grant. We were the pilot program for Pro Literacy in the FCADV, which is our coalition in Florida, to partner and assist survivors with their literacy. Housing employment advocacy, of course, education advocacy, and credit counseling. Partnerships are very important. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think we're getting to the next slide. I'm just going to continue. But the development of partnerships is very important. To our grant funders, and it's also very important to our community. Not to reinvent the wheel. Having those bank partnerships are very important. One meaningful partnership that we have for housing is with the Florida Housing Coalition as well, where they partner we still haven't got there yet. To the next slide. Okay, I think it's coming. Okay, so Florida Housing Coalition, where the Florida Housing Coalition partners tax credit properties with our program to provide affordable housing to our survivors. So if you have a housing coalition in your state, then it would be worth it to contact them to see if that's a possibility in your area. We have 5 primary components in our program, which is housing, adult basic education, which is ABE, financial literacy, job readiness, and credit counseling, small business development and training. The credit counseling piece is important, as we know, with the economic justice, because the survivors, they come to us with a lot from that relationship, a lot of debt, evictions. What we've been seeing a lot as well is survivors coming in with criminal histories, being made to, participate in criminal activity with the abuser. And from that, they now have their own criminal history. Next slide. In our financial literacy, there are a lot of curriculums, and I'm going to place one in our message box, the consumerfinance.gov. If you're not familiar with the CFPB, they have a lot of free resources. They also give you a workbook to teach you how to utilize those resources. So it's not just getting a hold of curriculum and not knowing how to teach it. The Money Smart FDIC, they also provide that online, where they give you the instructor's copy as well as the participant's copy. This year we received the Florida Literacy Grant through Wells Fargo to continue our business program. We lost the Allstate Foundation grant, but we continue that program with the Wells Fargo and Florida Literacy Coalition curriculum partnership. In our job readiness program, the Allstate Career Empowerment Curriculum is awesome, especially the first chapter, which goes over, their level of comfort for the survivor with putting their information on resumes, letting them know that they can use their email address and not need to put a physical address because, of safety reasons, but just going over the resume enhancement with the survivors. It also talks about what days of the week they would like to work, what shifts they would like to take. And in that chapter, it's also important to speak about deal breakers. So, you can't work weekends because you need public transportation, then going away from that. But that activity is very powerful if you can take a look at that curriculum as well. Next slide. If you can find funding for the credit counseling certification for someone, I guess it would make sense for the economic justice advocate or whomever does that work at your center to become certified. The knowledge is amazing. Just having what you would need to share with the survivors. In our program, we do utilize the Independence Loan Project through the NNEDV. It's a 4-week program where we speak to the survivors, have our bank partnerships come in. We also have the FPP through the United Way in our area come in and speak to the survivors and give them tools to coupon to save money that way. We also talk to the survivors about the breakdown of their FICO score. And identity theft is a big one, reminding them to look for the S and after the HTTP in their websites when they're going to make their online payments and things like that, to avoid being in contact with those fraudulent websites that can take their identity and their banking information. Our dispute letters workshop we do separate from the initial 4-week credit counseling workshop. The dispute letters is the next step to going through your credit report and not just disputing, things to have them fall off. I had a survivor in one of our groups tell us that that was one of the things that she was encouraged to do, is just to go and dispute everything off of her credit report, which is not the right thing to do, especially, when it's going to come back on when they find out that it's your debt. But aside from that, you could be bringing to light debt that no longer is really affecting your credit score. So we never know what people are being told, to do, and just making sure they have the correct information. So if you can take that, it's at your own pace curriculum, and I can also send that as well. Next slide. In the adult literacy program, we were also encouraging the survivors to think about their goal plans. In our all-state curriculum, or when we had the program, we were encouraged to meet with the survivors for a period of 1 year after they finished the core curriculum 6 to 8 week program. So in that way, we decided to have a monthly networking meeting where all of the survivors, they can come. We offer a morning and an afternoon session each month. And the survivors can come bring their business cards. They can do a survivor in the spotlight where they can advertise their businesses. We also have other schools, other programs come and talk about certification programs during those times. And it's a real true time to network and kind of get us away from the traditional support groups that we do and the financial empowerment groups that we do throughout the month. Those classes or groups have proven to be successful as well in completing the goal plans. With the goal plan forms that we utilize, I'm then able to see what else the survivors are looking at getting involved in, like if they wanted to get their GED or if they wanted to attend college and they wanted to apply for the WIS scholarship. When we first meet with the survivors, when they come into our office in whatever arena that is, we have to remember that they're in their trauma a lot of the times, and whatever they came in your door for, that's probably going to be the information that they hone in on. So if they came in to file relocation, then they may forget that they have the ability to participate in the literacy program, or that they have the ability to participate in credit counseling and, have the WIF scholarship and things like that. Having those monthly networking meetings, that's also another great opportunity to remind the survivors of all of the programs that we have. We can give them a folder of resources, but in transition, they may have to move, they may leave shelter. A lot of things can happen where they can misplace that folder and not have that information anymore. We also encourage a safe email where we can correspond and I can send them information, and they can also correspond with me when they need to schedule appointments or if they need to come by and get diapers or anything like that. That also helps with the survivors who aren't able to come that particular month, and I can also forward the forms and any information that we discussed during that monthly workshop. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, it's talking about the tax credit properties. So networking with your housing coalition for your state, that is the manner in which we develop that program. So they're very nice properties. We have a total of 7 right now. 3 of them are income-based, so if the survivors aren't employed or they don't have any source of income, they don't have any rent at that time. They're government properties. They just give us 5 set-asides from those 3 properties. And the other 4 are gated communities. They do have some nice amenities, internet cafe, they have an exercise room, and they also have pools as well in those other 4 locations. So they're very nice housing, units. And our highest rent is a 3-bedroom, 2-bath for $485 a month, which is really, really good. And we have 1 bedroom starting from $2.99 a month to $3.15 a month with that 40% discount that we get in that partnership with the tax credit properties. The extended shelter stay program was developed because our shelter is short term. We have a 6 to 8 week length of stay, but if a survivor, is needing that extra time to find work, to save money, if they want to participate in any of the economic empowerment programs, then we give them an additional 12 weeks in shelter, so that way they have the ability to work on their goal plans, look for housing, and whatever other goals that they are looking into. They're also offered childcare through our partnership with the Early Learning Coalition. The only thing about the program is it has an age restriction, so it's 6 weeks old to 8 years old. So a lot of parents run into the problems of having, a 9 or a 10-year-old and not have care for them because they can't leave them in the shelter. So then we have to get creative and try to figure out other ways of helping the survivor reach her goal and also have care for those children that don't meet the age requirement of that partnership. Through our coalition funds, we also have financial assistance and move-in support that we provide to prevent evictions for our survivors, to help move in, help with application fees. So if your coalition has, financial assistance dollars, then you may want to get creative in how you assist the survivors. Our coalition also came up with transportation dollars. We've never been able to help with car repairs or car payments or car insurance before, but those transportation dollars will now allow us to assist with those expenses as well. Career Source Polk, that's here in Florida, and they have Career Source Hillsborough, and it goes by county. So whatever your workforce board is in your area, is a very good partnership to have. Our workforce board houses our cash assistance or TANF department as well. So partnering with that department, so that way you can sign off on their hours that they have to do for their cash assistance, their community service hours. So it's for us, it was like a 10-page application. We had to turn in our tax ID number and things like that. And if they wanted to participate in the literacy program or the credit counseling program, or if they just wanted to work with the economic justice program on finding housing, then we can sign off on their community service hours while they're working on their goal plan, doing those activities. So that's also another way of helping them to keep their cash assistance while they need it and also meet the requirement of those hours. Next slide, please. Okay, and we already discussed the WISC Scholarship Program. It's a national program. We have them in all of the states, and that program has been very good for our survivors. We currently have 8 survivors enrolled right now who are in post-secondary programs as well as universities. And here is just listing those survivors to date of May who completed the programs utilizing the WISC. The WISC scholarship assists with their education as well as their monthly bills to prevent them from not finishing their program if they, run into a situation with their rent or car problems, things like that. It does everything except for any court fees. So it's a really good program for survivors who want to achieve a certification or a degree. So as long as the program is at least 6 months or longer, it takes about 2 months for them to be approved. And it's pretty easy for them to qualify. I've only had one survivor not qualify, and that's because she wanted to go to like a technical college and receive a medical assistance degree, and it was like $40,000 or something outrageous. So when she's changed schools, then she was able to get that approved. Next slide, please. So here's my contact information. It was a little hard for me to talk over my echo. So I had the phone a little far away from me so I can't hear myself and trip up over my words. But I will put all of the information into the chat box so that way you'll have it for those links. And I'm also going to put the link for the Mass Mutual, which is the $50,000 life insurance policies that survivors can utilize for their children if they, Lord forbid, pass away, and they can have that for their educational uses. But you can also take a look at those resources as well. And thank you again.
And thank you so much, Tanika, for all that information. I know it was like jam-packed and there was a lot. We definitely had a request in terms of getting information on that consumer finance website. So I'd love it if you could take a few minutes and just type into the chat box that consumer finance website, the life insurance policy information, and if folks have other questions in terms of resources, feel free to put that into the chat box. And I'd love to hear from everyone. Go ahead and in terms of the chat box, would love to hear like what struck you and resonated for you in terms of what Tanika's offered, and are there strategies and tools that you can take forward in your work? We'd love to hear both of those things, and then we will also hear from you in terms of your strategies. But why don't we start with like what strategies or tools that you heard today might be useful for you in the work? And also, if you have particular questions for Tanika, again, feel free to put out in the chat box. And as folks get started in terms of sharing that, I think that one of the pieces that I really think, Tanika, that was so crucial in what you were saying is the piece in terms of just having strong partnerships and multiple sources of funding. I was really struck by how you spoke about the program in terms of economic freedom, and also that it's relatively new. If I remember right, you were saying that it was just about 4 years old. So I think I'm so excited to know that this program exists, and also that it's so crucial in terms of survivors leading the goal planning, and that the partnerships are really what makes it possible, both with your coalitions, the Housing Coalition, the State Coalition, and just the various opportunities in terms of educational partnerships. I also particularly loved how you have sort of a modified support group model in terms of enabling networking and enabling survivors to share strategies and resources, and also, again, those partnerships with schools and businesses that make that networking possible. Great question. So Jean is just also asking how these programs are funded. So Tanika, can you talk a little bit maybe about how the Economic Freedom program started, when it started, and just like some of the various sources of funding you've had, and again, maybe just chart out some of the crucial partnerships?
When we first began the program, we were funded by the All-State Grant. As time went on, 2 years we had that grant, and then we received the Pro Literacy Grant, and we had that grant for 2 years, and that funded the program. Gas cards, gift cards for group participation, the funding for the survivors to reach their certification goals, their match savings goals, and as well as starting up their small businesses. The VOCA dollars that we were funded down from last year. I think we received like $20,000 from VOCA, and we could also keep the programs going with the certifications, the group incentives, gas cards, gift cards, bill pay, and our coalition set asides for participant assistance.
Awesome. So I think I heard, just to kind of, again, reflect back what you're saying, Tanika. So Allstate was definitely a crucial funder, and then other Florida coalition partnerships. But it sounds too like you're doing a great job in terms of using VOCA and other federal dollars in terms of amplifying maybe particular private foundation resources. So that's amazing in terms of, again, like accessing some of the funds that might be generally available for victims of crime or for survivors of violence, and really targeting those resources. I'd love to hear a little bit more too, I know, in terms of, especially since so many folks on the phone had talked about housing and transportation as issues. Can you talk a little bit about your partnership with the Housing Coalition, and just in ways in terms of like how that works? And also, I know that you had mentioned the 9 different units that you have, and just how you got those units and partnerships in place. And also, like, you know, if there's a way that you're working towards getting more units.
For now, our partnerships are strictly through the contact that we have, and her name is Elaine at our Florida Housing Coalition. I'm not sure how the coalitions work through, out of the rest of the world, but it was also a partnership that our former director guided us through. So what happens is the tax credit properties, they reach out to the Housing Coalition, and then they reach out to the partnerships that they have closest to where the tax credit property is going to be built. And then we partner from there. We draft up an MOU. They let us know how much the rents are going to be and how many set-asides we're going to have. We do have a brand new complex that is being built right now that we partner with and signed the MOU. So that'll be a new property coming available, and they said it should be done the earlier part of 2019. So it's strictly through the Florida Housing Coalition, and it was developed through the director we had at the time that the program was developed, which was a couple of years back.
Awesome. And it sounds to me like y'all are using, incentives in terms of tax credits and other building and new development incentives to enable, again, access for units that may not be available to survivors otherwise. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
Awesome. So I know some folks have been asking if this recording will be available later in the presentation, and yes, it is. We are, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we are recording this webinar, and so you'll have a chance to look back through all the information. Again, I know it was super dense in terms of everything that Tanika spoke about. So yes, we'll definitely send out to the folks who've logged in the link to the recording once that's available. So thank you for that question. Are there other questions that folks have, or strategies or tools or resources that you feel like would be useful for survivors that you're working with, or also other strategies that you are bringing to the table in terms of what's working in your communities? We know absolutely that every jurisdiction, every state is different in terms of both barriers. Tanika mentioned, I think, some really crucial ones like survivors who are returning to communities or have legal records, and like how do we work around that, as well as, in terms of folks have mentioned work authorization. And again, would love to hear from you all, like what strategies are working with communities and survivors that you're working with. And you can feel free to just write into the chat box. Awesome. Well, you know what I think, folks, as you're thinking, I'd love to hear if folks have a sense of what economic justice would look like for survivors, particularly survivors of color and Indigenous survivors. So if you have any thoughts on that, feel free to type in. Again, I was really struck by, Tanika, you're speaking to this program as an economic freedom program. And I think, you know, again, that use of the word freedom and just like thinking about what does it mean to actually be free? So thank you for that kind of situating in terms of what economic justice would look like for survivors in terms of not just independence, but also that ability, again, to pursue goals and opportunities. Right. So I wanted to let you all know, as folks think about economic justice and economic freedom, we have 2 more webinars this summer. They're both on Tuesdays. So one is next week, and we're particularly diving into detention and incarceration issues, particularly for immigrant survivors, as well as sexually exploited youth. And I'm so excited to have Jessica Camacho and Jennifer Swain speak in terms of the work that they're doing with deportation defense, as well as working with sexually exploited youth and alternatives to juvenile justice systems. So again, particularly in this moment that we are right now, these issues in terms of immigrant detention, juvenile justice, and mass incarceration are so crucial in terms of our communities and ensuring that we are enabling survivors to actually access safety. And then we will have in early August, August 7th, a webinar that again goes into reproductive justice issues, but also income and credit building specifically. So that will also be another opportunity for some practical hands-on information, particularly from the organization Free From in terms of survivor work. So thank you so much, folks, for talking to access to educational opportunities, as well as safe and affordable housing. And I know Tanika had spoken to all of that as being so crucial, which it is. So thank you all so much for really depicting that in terms of economic justice for survivors. You can find here at the Women of Color Network our economic policy and leadership webinar recordings and PowerPoint and fact sheets on our website. It's at www.wsninc.org /economic and policy leadership. And then you can also definitely sign up for our mailing list on our website. It's on the right side of the screen on the homepage, and also follow us on Twitter. I wanted to really end in terms of thinking about what does economic justice have to do with movement building. And one of the amazing activities that we've seen has been the Mama's Bailout movement, and particularly, again, in a work to not criminalize poverty and to ensure that folks actually have access to legal recourse and safety. That's been an incredible movement of individuals really just pooling resources to bail out folks who are being held without being charged. So that movement has been so inspiring in terms of really ensuring that women in jails, and particularly mothers, who are able to actually not lose out in more resources, particularly without having had access to a trial or some kind of legal remedies. I also wanted to lift up Kiyomi Fujikawa, who at one of our Western Regional Forums spoke to the importance of violence prevention strategies. And Kiyomi talked about how shifting the economic realities for trans people is essential and is a violence prevention strategy because trans survivors may stay in relationships to fulfill basic needs. And also that systems are more invasive than one person, and so we need policy that build power, and that our solutions aren't traditional. Trans brilliance is happening and shows our resilience. So as much as we're struggling with all of the structural barriers that we see and history of oppression, we also know that we have resilience and brilliance, which Kiyomi really centers. And within that vein, we really want to situate, as we close from the Women of Color Network perspective, that we see healing and interdependence as part of liberation. Noreen Hill spoke to how I use my culture to get back my healing and wellness, and that we are medicine for each other. And Elle Hearn speaks to how we should center work on violence, and that we need to create opportunities for love. So often in this work, we're constantly fighting the battle in terms of how do we enable safety, how do we enable a basic humanity, and it's so useful to remember that, yes, we are medicine for each other, that this work is medicine, and that we are ultimately creating more opportunities for love. So thank you all so much for joining us on this webinar. We'd love to hear from you in terms of, again, strategies that might work for you or what you heard. And again, thank you so much for the work that each of you do every day in terms of enabling access to resources for survivors. Your work is so crucial. And always, always so urgent, and even more so these days. So thank you so much for the work that you do every day and for ensuring safety and liberation for our communities. So that's it. Feel free if any folks have more questions to type them into the chat box. But otherwise, we will be back next week with our next webinar. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.